This video features a paid partnership with BetterHelp, but more on them later. Medical history holds some of the most gruesome, cruelest, and bizarre tales known to us, from malpractice to horrific hygiene practices, brutal instruments, and malicious patient care. But none are quite so close to home than the history of treatment of those with mental illnesses, particularly those in the care of asylums. Asylums, an antiquated and loaded term thankfully retired from the field of mental health, formerly also known as lunatic or insane asylums, were an early version of psychiatric hospitals. Since their establishment, there have been various schools of thought on how best to treat patients, or, as they were more commonly known, inmates. And it was the mental health crisis of a monarch that led the doctors to realise that mental health conditions could be treated at all. Unfortunately, these asylums quickly turned into prisons where undesirable citizens were isolated from the public, and the inmates were subjected to horrifying treatments which were medieval in nature, including bloodletting, straitjackets, electric shock therapy, drugging, and lobotomies. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain entered a period of time that became known as the trade in lunacy, where private madhouses were being set up at an astonishing rate compared to anywhere else in the world. But one of the most famous of these asylums is known as Bedlam. Now, you're probably quite familiar with the word Bedlam. It's typically used to describe a chaotic situation, one that goes beyond the realms of sanity and predictability. Recounting a situation that was manic, you might say, were you in a somewhat melodramatic mood, that the situation was absolute bedlam, and you would do so all because the reputation of a mental asylum has maintained itself for hundreds of years, so much so that it's become part of your vernacular without a second thought. Well, technically, there was never any Bedlam, but there was a Bethlehem hospital. In the 13th century, Simon Fitzmary rose from modest origins to become the Sheriff of London, twice. He was said to have venerated the Virgin Mary and the Star of Bethlehem, which developed during his time in the Crusades. When he became a wealthy political figure, Fitzmary donated a piece of land in the Bishopsgate world of the City of London to the Bishop of Bethlehem to create a charitable hospital. In 1247, the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem was founded, devoted to healing sick paupers. The small establishment became known as Bethlehem Hospital, but Londoners lately abbreviated this term to Bedlam, and then it was later pronounced Bedlam. It was originally built on the site that's now covered by Liverpool Street Station in London and consisted of a single storey. It was a compact building that covered just 2 acres. Centred around the courtyard was a chapel in the middle, and it had approximately 12 cells for patients, a kitchen, staff accommodation, and an exercise yard. It remained on the site for over 400 years until 1676, and it moved to Moorfields, also in the City of London. Its reputation for taking those in struggling with their mental health began sometime in the 14th century, when monks at the hospital began accepting patients who had symptoms of mental illness rather than purely physical disabilities and disease. In 1346, as the hospital struggled to survive, London agreed to take over it. Its subsequent specialisation in madness gave it a future, though it's important to stress here that those considered mad included those with learning disabilities, epilepsy, and dementia. By 1403, lunatic patients formed the majority of Bethlehem's patients, and so England's first, and perhaps most infamous, mental institution was born. But before we get any further into this video, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's paid partnership, which is with BetterHelp, because whilst the history of mental health is very important, so is taking care of your mental health, which is why I thought it was important to mention here. Now, I've been using BetterHelp for over 2 years now, and I've encouraged at least 4 people in my life so far to join it, and they're all thriving and enjoying BetterHelp, so I'm really excited to tell you about it. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy accessible and not terrifying to people like the history of mental health is. And even when you get the confidence to find out and get a new therapist, finding a good therapist can be really hard. But BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist so easy and simple. You don't have to search for hours or go through the internet or travel to get support. It's entirely online and remote. and you could be matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a few days after filling out a simple questionnaire. BetterHelp match you based on your needs and the type of therapist that you would like. And it's just like dating. Sometimes therapists that you're given aren't a good match for you, but it's so easy to switch to find another at no extra cost. I got lucky with the first 2 times I signed up to my therapist. I wanted someone who was LGBTQI friendly, who was also a woman, potentially around my age, and I've hit it off with both of my therapists first time, and they've completely transformed my life. So whether you are suffering with anxiety or depression or just going through a really tough time right now and you don't really have anyone to talk to, then therapy will give you the tools that you need to approach your life in a different way. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/Cinzia. Clicking that link helps support this channel but also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. So the Bedlam Hospital at Moorfields was quite a stunning piece of architecture, resembling the Palace of Versailles more than it did a hospital. Bethlem's new home was an opulent architectural statement designed by an assistant to Christopher Wren, the city surveyor and natural philosopher Robert Hooke. Granted a substantial budget, Hooke delivered a vast and palatial building complete with an ornate 165-metre facade and formal gardens. Bethlem's grandeur was entirely superficial, however, a false symbol of civic pride and charity. The hospital, despite its physical beauty, was fundamentally a fearful place shaped by prejudice, inequality and superstition. Its patients were usually from impoverished and marginalised communities, and their lack of familial or platonic support made them incredibly vulnerable to cruel and vicious treatment. You see, mental health was treated as though it could be removed from a patient's body by physical force, believing it was a disease of the body rather than the brain. So medical staff bled their patients from their veins, blistered their skin with caustic substances, induced recurring bouts of vomiting and diarrhoea, shaved patients' heads, and subjected them to ice-cold baths, all in the hopes of forcing melancholic humours out of their patients' bodies. Daily exposure to such extreme treatments, as you can imagine, often resulted in death. For example, cold bathing was introduced at Bedlam in the 1680s, and it became a way of shocking inmates out of mental illness, and remained a popular course of treatment for much of the 18th century. Patients would be submerged into cold water for long periods of time, and then wrapped up in towels that had also been soaked in ice or sprayed with cold water, all in a building that had drafts and no heating. Another strange treatment was developed by the grandfather of Charles Darwin himself, Erasmus Darwin. Rotational therapy, as it was called, usually involved placing a patient in a chair suspended from a beam by ropes attached to its legs. The chair would then be turned 20 to 40 times one way and then allowed to spin back to its original position. Darwin himself in 1796 recommended that the practice be performed for an hour or two, 3 or 4 times per month. The logic behind this was that it was deemed to be an effective way to evacuate the bowels, bladder and stomach and make an impression on the organs of sensibility, that being the brain and the nervous system. It was also thought that this treatment would induce restful sleep in a patient, much like, rocking a baby. But as you can imagine, the swing chair was also used as a form of punishment, a way of asserting dominance over their patients who refused to comply to staff orders. The hospital regime was a mixture of punishment and religious devotion. Chains, manacles, locks and stocks appeared on the hospital inventory from time to time. The shock of corporal punishment was believed to cure some conditions, whilst isolation was thought to help people come to their senses. At the same time, it was a religious duty to care for and feel compassionate for people afflicted by madness. By the 17th century, Bedlam had passed into the common lexicon and became a satirical byword for the horrors that might await anyone receiving treatment for mental health conditions. The 18th century saw a rapid expansion of London's population and a decline in traditional treatment for insanity within the family home. Bedlam had space for just over 120 patients and a huge waiting list for admissions. As a consequence, many private madhouses appeared around London, some of which were no more than unregulated prisons that enabled families to lock up perfectly sane but inconvenient relatives. By 1750, a group of medical reformers wished to see a progressive alternative to Bedlam, and this was St. Luke's Hospital. It was located directly opposite Bedlam, with William Batty serving as a chief physician. In contrast to traditional medical thinking, Batty publicly denounced the use of bleeding, blisters, caustics, opium, cold baths and vomits in favour of patients being, quote, removed from all objects that were known to cause their disorder. This was a highly controversial take at the time, and it angered doctors in Bedlam, who felt offended by such a stance. Bedlam's then doctor, John Monroe, strongly disagreed with Batty's methods, writing that the most adequate and constant cure is by evacuation, and that he never saw or heard of a bad effect of vomits. The two doctors battled quite publicly and promoted their views in books, both of which became quite popular and accepted by reading material by those in the field of medicine, despite having very conflicting approaches to medicine. St. Luke's had a very different approach to mental health treatment. It treated its patients through individual diagnosis and care under a theory that there were many forms of mental illness and not just one. At the heart of patient care was a clean, calm environment, and St. Luke's did not accept paying customers to view its patients. Oh wait, have I not explained that part yet? Oh, allow me to disturb you further. So, adding to the misery of having no clothing or heating and being subjected to rats, and medical officers whose adherence to debilitating purgative cures had become increasingly outdated to contemporary practice, conditions in Bedlam fell into steep decline, to the extent that in the 16th century inspectors reported that it was uninhabitable. Quote, "It is not fit for any man to dwell in, which was left by the keeper for that it was so loathsomely filthy, kept not fit for any man to come into the house." Compared to its beautiful outside, inside the building was stark, dirty and cold. There were no glazed windows or hot water. With the habitable parts were small fetid cells populated by several people chained to walls or their beds, and they were chained to avoid violent outbursts which were quite commonplace. Many of the patients were stark naked, with a single blanket to protect them from the cold and the rats. One of these patients was Anna Stone, whose treatment was called an act of disgusting idiocy. Patients' limbs were found to be crippled with cold and subject to injury by raving patients with whom they were chained to. An inspection committee in 1814 were horrified by the sight of patients. One patient was called James Norris, and he was described as a clear and lucid man whose neck was tightly chained to an iron bar on the wall. With additional metal restraints to his chest, waist, feet and arms, Norris complained that his muscles were atrophied and painful following a decade of confinement. The staff described Norris as violent and dangerous, but to the MPs inspecting, he seemed quite quiet and perhaps even sane. The inspectors had seen enough and called for parliamentary inquiry into the conditions of Bedlam. But until that point, Bedlam had been in a terrible state and it needed money. You see, the grand facade had been crumbling, not just reputationally, but physically. Its extravagant facade was so heavy that it actually began to crack and expose patients to leaking and drafts. It was later emerged that in the hospital, it was constructed on rubble surrounding the London Wall, and it lacked even proper foundations to be standing. But as rumours and stories about the hospital and its patients spread, Bedlam became subject to morbid public curiosity. And whenever the public becomes fascinated with something, opportunities to make money become prevalent. The people of this era loved what is now known as a freak show, and the hospital welcomed paying customers with open arms to gawp at its residents. For as little as a penny, anyone could gain access to Bedlam's wards in order to stare at, taunt, or abuse inmates. The once charitable hospital quickly became a museum of the insane, a public attraction that was reported, though not verified, to have garnered a footfall of up to 96,000 visitors a year. Bedlam became the top tourist attraction for Londoners, second only to St. Paul's Cathedral. Whilst the hospital displayed a disturbing lack of humanity for its patients, some of the visitors are the only reasons why we have true insight into how the hospital was run. Diarist Ned Ward visited Bedlam in 1699 and found himself immersed in a terrifying world of noise and disorder. He wrote, quote, "We heard such a rattling of chains, drumming of doors, ranting, hollering, singing and rattling that I could think of nothing but a vision of the damned broke loose and put hell in an uproar." With patients locked in their cells, Ward was able to join in other visitors by making taunts and jeers through the bars and peepholes. Some inmates were verbally insulted whilst others were goaded into doing and saying ridiculous things. Those who were beyond conversation tried to dissuade people by staring at them or by spitting at them or throwing objects. And if they were suffering from melancholia, some didn't respond at all. For the medical professionals at the time, there was no harm in taunting the mentally ill. 18th century medicine dictated that madness robbed the individual of shame, emotion, and reason to the extent that any verbal or physical abuse that they suffered would, in theory, have no lasting effect. Charging admission and accepting donations was a lucrative business model. It raised over £450 a year for the hospital, and staff took the opportunity to top up their salaries with bribes and private tours and access to certain cells and wards. Bedlam was more than just an attraction. It was an indulgence in all that was sinful. Intermixed with the cacophony of smells and sights, the wards had prostitutes, pickpockets and merchants selling food and drink and trinkets within the building. Bedlam, wrote Ward in his journal, quote, is an almshouse for madmen, a showing room for whores and a sure market for lectures, a dry walk for loiterers. No one had any hope of being cured in Bedlam. Brian Cowther, a surgeon at Bedlam from 1789 to 1815, was reported to be generally insane and mostly drunk, and there were reports of widespread alcoholism, of buckled ceilings and walls, and of male staff members visiting female galleries where patients were likely sexually assaulted and raped. Though the hospital was making money from its patients, it certainly didn't invest it back into the building structure or securing the facility for any of its patients. One commenter denounced the hospital as a, quote, crazy carcass with no walls, still vertical, a veritable Hogarthian auto-satire. The cost of maintaining this crumbling civic edifice was deemed financially imprudent, and it was eventually demolished in 1815. In 1815, Bedlam was moved from its collapsing Moorfields site to a new building at St George's Fields, south of the Thames. Lessons had been learned, and the combination of a new building and new staff members brought reforms many had been calling for decades. An 1818 report found patients clean, amply supplied with wholesome provisions and well-clothed, with none under restraint. A financial audit also suggested that the hospital was solvent and generally well managed. Though it's not the end to all the horrifying stories of Bedlam, it was the end of a horrific era. There are more stories to tell of this hospital and the people involved in it, but this is where I shall leave this story for today. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to this channel, and thank you as always to my patrons for making this possible. Please be kind to yourself, be happy and healthy, and remember, books save lives, so keep reading.